Hello and thanks for joining us on Arirang News. These are the stories making the headlines at this hour.
President Lee Jae-myung attended the G7 summit in France and discussed private investment for international development, as well as AI cooperation. On the sidelines of the event, he also briefly met with U.S. President Donald Trump and asked him to lead a peaceful approach on North Korea. And Trump says Iran will never have a nuclear weapon under a new framework agreement reached with the United States. The deal also reportedly includes $300 billion of private investment to rebuild Iran's infrastructure, with over half the sum already committed by global firms. With the framework deal with Iran now reached, the tension is now turning to ending the war in Ukraine. Trump says he had productive talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the G7 summit, pledged further support to Kyiv and urged Moscow to make a deal to end the four-year war.
As the final leg of his trip to Europe, President Lee Jae-myung attended the G7 summit in France. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
World leaders are in the French town of Evian-les-Bains for the gathering of the world's most influential powers. Leaders from the G7 countries were present, including U.S. President Donald Trump, and 5 other leaders were invited, including South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. The host, French President Emmanuel Macron, greeted guests one by one.
How are you, Mr. President? I'm so happy. How are you?
The session began with a group photo during which President Lee met his American counterpart Trump for a short greeting. In the readout, the Blue House said Trump asked Lee about recent developments in inter-Korean relations, and Lee asked Trump to lead a peaceful resolution of issues relating to North Korea, noting Trump's contribution to the recent U.S.-Iran peace agreement. Trump reportedly responded positively. Tuesday's session addressed reforming current international development cooperation system, aiming to reduce financial dependency on external assistance and create pro-growth incentives. In line with that, the South Korean president stressed the importance of private capital, introducing a recent case where South Korea helped Indonesia secure private investment worth $50 million through its financial assistance in the agriculture and energy sectors. President Lee pitched his vision for a global AI-basic society, where the fruits of AI technology are shared with all countries, and he also brought up the need to bolster vocational training in developing nations. At the summit, the group of 7 leaders adopted 3 joint statements on mutually beneficial international partnerships, a coordinated response to recent Ebola outbreak, and the fight against cancer. Later in the day, the leaders joined a social dinner and a concert in the small French town, which sits on the southern shore of Lake Geneva.
President Lee says his attendance at the G7 for the second consecutive year demonstrates the trust and expectations of the international community, vowing to safeguard national interests and fulfill South Korea's responsible role on the global stage. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News, Geneva.
And on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Evian, President Lee Jae-myung held a series of bilateral talks with fellow leaders. On Tuesday, he met with the prime ministers of Canada and Germany to discuss ways to deepen cooperation. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yoo-jin reports.
President Lee Jae-myung's summit diplomacy continued on the sidelines of the G7 summit. On Tuesday, he held back-to-back talks with the leaders of Canada and Germany. President Lee and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney focused on deepening strategic cooperation in defense, security, energy, and critical minerals.
지금은 유사 입장국으로서 서로에게 도움이 되는 관계로 양국 관계가 매우 발전하고 있습니다. 우리 서로 협력할 게 많으니까 오늘 어떤 협력을 더 구체적으로 할지 한번 논의해 보기로 하죠.
Since we last met in Korea, our partnerships continue to grow. We're working across defense, across investment, across trade, on all aspects, including on the cultural side. So it's.
According to the Blue House, President Lee said that Korea is prepared to help strengthen Canada's defense capabilities as a trusted partner. Prime Minister Carney responded that Canada places great importance on cooperation with Korea and agreed to continue discussions on related initiatives. The meeting comes as Korea's Hanwha Ocean and Germany's TKMS compete for a multi-billion-dollar submarine contract from Canada. Citing Canada's Secretary of State for Defense Procurement, Politico reported last Saturday that Ottawa expects to select its preferred bidder within 30 days. Before meeting with Prime Minister Carney, President Lee held separate talks with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. High on the agenda was expanding cooperation in the economy, defense, science and technology sectors, as well as international security.
독일과 대한민국은 많은 영역에서 서로 협력하고 또 협력을 통해 시너지를 만들 수 있는 국가라고 생각합니다.
On defense, the two leaders discussed moving beyond competition toward joint research and development, co-production, and joint entry into third country markets. Chancellor Merz also invited President Lee to the Asia-Pacific Conference of German Business, which will be held in Seoul later this year.
So I'm very much looking forward to my visit to your country by the end of October. We invite you to give a speech and to be part of this important conference.
More bilateral meetings are expected on Wednesday, the final day of this year's G7 summit. 송유진, Arirang News.
A new U.S.-Iran framework agreement has halted the 15-week conflict and permanently blocked Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. A $300 billion private investment fund has been established to back the peace deal, with over half the sum already committed by global firms. Our Kim Do-yeon has the details.
Iran will be permanently barred from developing or acquiring nuclear weapons under a new framework agreement reached with the United States. That's according to U.S. President Donald Trump at the G7 summit in France on Tuesday as he addressed the U.S.-Iran deal to end the war.
Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. That's what it says. It won't have one to buy, to develop. They will not have a nuclear weapon. And I would say that's about 99.9% of what I wanted, because we couldn't let that happen.
The Memorandum of Understanding also secures immediate halt of the 15-week conflict and the permanent, toll-free reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, a critical global oil supply route. President Trump noted that the deal has already begun impacting global markets.
The ships are starting to move nicely, oil is starting to go, and the prices are coming down rapidly. Stock market is going up rapidly. A lot of good things are happening.
The formal signing ceremony is scheduled for this Friday in Switzerland, after which there will be a 60-day period to finalize the treaty. According to multiple reports, a $300 billion private investment vehicle named the Reconstruction and Development Fund has been established to rebuild Iran. Reuters reports that more than half of that sum has already been committed by international corporations, including firms from South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and the United States. The White House and Vice President J.D. Vance emphasized that the fund is entirely private, utilizing zero U.S. government grants, taxpayer money, or state reparations. The fund remains strictly separate from parallel negotiations regarding the lifting of primary U.S. sanctions and the release of frozen Iranian sovereign assets, and it will not become operational until a final treaty is signed. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
And U.S. President Donald Trump says he's shifting his focus to ending the war in Ukraine after reaching a framework agreement with Iran. Speaking at the G7 summit in France, Trump said he had productive talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and urged Russia to negotiate a peace deal. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
President Donald Trump said Tuesday that he wants to turn his attention to ending the war in Ukraine after reaching a framework agreement with Iran, and told reporters that the Middle East issue will soon be in the rear-view mirror. Speaking on the sidelines of the Group of Seven summit in France, Trump said he had a very good meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and planned to meet him again later in the day. Trump said he would do whatever he could to help bring an end to the conflict and urged Russia to negotiate a settlement. The U.S. leader noted that both Russia and Ukraine have suffered heavy losses during the war and stressed that a deal should be reached as soon as possible.
Look, Russia should make a deal. Russia's lost tremendous amounts of people, and so has Ukraine. Last month, they lost 35,000 soldiers between the two of them.
Ukraine continues to demonstrate its ability to strike targets deep inside Russia, using drones and missiles to put growing pressure on the Kremlin, while Moscow has vowed to carry out what it calls systematic attacks on Ukraine. Early Monday, Russian forces launched a series of deadly attacks on Kyiv, including an attack that set fire to a historic monastery. Despite the ongoing challenges, Trump struck an optimistic tone, saying he had productive conversations with both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Zelensky ahead of the summit. He added that there may now be an opportunity to make progress toward ending the war as diplomatic efforts gain renewed attention from world leaders gathered at the G7. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And now for more on the G7 summit in France, we're joined today by Dr. Ban Gil-ju, Assistant Professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Ban, thanks for coming on today.
Good to be with you.
So this is the second year in a row that President Lee Jae-myung has attended the G7 summit, right? What was his main goal and what message the South Korea able to send to the international community?
The Rock administration's diplomatic policy is based upon pragmatic diplomacy. This concept seeks interest maximization, which requires diplomatic flexibility, strategic space, risk management, and geopolitical and diplomatic expansion. To that end, South Korea makes various diplomatic efforts, such as security diplomacy, inclusive diplomacy, and expanded diplomacy. In particular, when it comes to expanded diplomacy, the Lee administration has laid out G7 plus diplomacy. Attending the G7 summit twice in a row is harmonious with this diplomacy. Meanwhile, the 2026 G7 summit deals with key agendas like the Iran war, development programs, AI, digital, and countering Ebola. With that in mind, first of all, South Korea as a global responsible power needs to send a message of its enhanced role in international stability and prosperity. Second, when it comes to maritime security around the Strait of Hormuz, Seoul should send a robust and clear signal that it is willing to make a great effort, not simply to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but to make it back to the international strait in a situation where South Korea is armed with assets enough to do that, such as minesweepers. Third, Seoul needs to show its passion for how to make the best of AI for all humans on the globe in the sense that it seeks to be one of the major AI powers. Fourth, since G7 is based upon a like-minded diplomacy, Seoul should take advantage of this platform for various cooperations, including economic security and critical mineral cooperation. Finally, South Korea needs to serve as an active player for normalizing the functions of international organizations such as the UN in a situation where rules and norms are dysfunctional around the world.
Right, and President Lee also got to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump, and he also sat down for talks with the Canadian Prime Minister. And with Seoul seeking now to secure a submarine deal with Canada, what do these meetings mean for Korea's broader diplomatic interests?
As you might be aware, one of the reasons why leaders should attend major multilateral meetings such as the G7 is that they are able to raise their voices on key agendas, leading to their enhancement of national status and diplomatic interests. The other reason is that they are able to get the chance for various bilateral meetings through this opportunity. In a sense, these bilateral meetings could be more valuable than multilateral meetings themselves. So, the more bilateral meetings are held, the better states are for their diplomatic interests. With this in mind, first of all, the ROC-US summit could be very meaningful if it can be made in this G7 summit because the bilateral summit helps clarify the recently designed alliance architecture under the name of alliance modernization. In particular, this summit is expected to contribute to making key programs like the nuclear-powered submarine project more viable and gain momentum. Second, the bilateral summit between South Korea and Canada matters as well in a situation where, as you mentioned earlier, South Korea jumped into the CPSP, Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, a project worth 60 trillion won, and a final decision is expected to be made anytime soon. The Lee administration is aimed at rising to one of the four major powers in the world in terms of military-industrial sector. South Korea's success in winning this project has a great impact on achieving this objective. Moreover, the possible cooperation on the submarine project between the two countries can create synergy for a more comprehensive cooperation, including economic security and information sharing, simply beyond the military-industrial cooperation. In the meantime, as many bilateral meetings as possible, simply beyond these meetings with the United States, Canada, and Germany, need to be made in order to visualize the G7 plus diplomacy and enhance South Korea's national prestige.
I see. And the U.S.-Iran conflict also dominated discussions at the G7 meeting, especially with Trump claiming that the Strait of Hormuz will be completely open by Friday. But questions remain over waterway fees and Israeli military operations. How do you think these issues will play out from here?
Well, although the signing ceremony will be held on Friday, both the United States and Iran have already signed the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, electronically, which means that key items take effect now. So as of right now, the Strait of Hormuz has started to open. That's a good news. However, we need to closely monitor how situations are going with care, despite the good news that the initial deal was made at the moment. First, this deal is not far from the end of the war, but close to a more consolidated ceasefire than the previous one. Technically, the fights ended, but the war is not over yet. What that means is that war could resume without a successful final deal made under the 6-day negotiations. Second, reopening the Strait of Hormuz for 60 days does not mean that all issues are resolved for the free use of the seas in the Middle East. In particular, since the MOU has not been made public yet, concern is growing that Iran might demand waterway fees after 60 days. To top it up, there's a growing concern that the United States also might remain silent over Iran's attempt to demand waterway fees after 60 days. That's why the international community wants the MOU to be made public as soon as possible so that they will be able to play a role in order for preventing the worst case scenario from happening. Third, as you noted, Israel could be recognized as a key factor in how things are going in the region. Particularly, Iran strongly wants to include Lebanon in the non-conflict zones under the deal. But Israel shows its willingness to continue its fight against Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Israel's offense in Lebanon could derail the peace roadmap being made under the MOU framework. Finally, hardliners in Iran, such as the IRGC, cannot be excluded as one of the key issues in a situation where they strongly oppose this deal. If they attempt to make provocations despite this deal, the military and security situations could be shaky. All in all, the deal is a positive sign, but at the same time, risk management still matters.
Right, we'll have to see how the situation plays out. All right, Professor Ban, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your time and insight. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Korean retail investors poured over $800 million into SpaceX shares on the company's first day of trading, underscoring strong demand for high-profile U.S. stocks. According to a financial investment industry official on Wednesday, individual investors purchased a net $808 million worth of SpaceX shares on June 12 through 11 brokerage firms. The buying spree came on SpaceX's NASDAQ debut and marked one of the largest single-day purchases of a single U.S. stock by Korean retail investors. Meanwhile, North Korea has condemned a recent large-scale live-fire exercise by Japan's ground self-defense force, calling it a, quote, test of reinvasion capability. In an article on Tuesday, the ruling party newspaper Nodongshinmun claimed Japan's counter-strike capability was a preemptive strike capability. It also said the inclusion of long-range missiles and high-speed glide weapons in the early June drill implies Japan has ushered in active preparations for preemptive strikes. Also making reference to Japan's annual defense white paper that describes North Korea as an imminent threat, The newspaper added that the target of the recent Japanese training was clear.
Good morning, I'm Chi Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. The FBI thwarted a planned attack on the UFC event held at the White House over the weekend. Court documents revealed on Tuesday show that 5 people were arrested. The alleged plot involved using explosive-laden drones to strike the north side of the White House to funnel attendees toward an exit where snipers planned to fire on fleeing politicians. Authorities discovered the plot after the mother of one suspect called police in Ohio to report her son's weapons purchases. President Trump attended the event on his 80th birthday without incident alongside senior Republican lawmakers and donors. The 5 suspects appear to subscribe to anti-government conspiracy theories and were motivated in part by anger over the handling of files related to Jeffrey Epstein. At least 3 face charges of conspiracy to commit murder. A magnitude 6.7 earthquake struck central Indonesia's Sulawesi island on Tuesday, injuring dozens of people and damaging homes in a region still haunted by a deadly quake and tsunami 8 years ago. The quake was centered about 43 kilometers east-southeast of Palu at a depth of 10 kilometers. Strong shaking sent residents fleeing into open areas, and several hospitals evacuated patients outdoors. At least 32 people were injured, including 8 seriously in the hardest-hit Sigi Regency, and more than 100 were displaced. More than 55 aftershocks followed throughout the day. In 2018, an earthquake and a tsunami killed more than 4,000 people in the same region. India temporarily blocked the messaging app Telegram on Tuesday, saying that it was used to leak the questions for the National Medical Entrance Exam. The ban runs until June 22nd and comes after the government canceled the medical entrance test and voided the results of more than 2 million students last month over allegations its questions had been leaked. Telegram said the ban punishes more than 150 million ordinary users in India rather than those who leaked the materials, adding the leaks had simply moved to other apps. A digital rights group called the measure a disproportionate response. Google and Apple received orders to temporarily delist Telegram from their app stores. Australia's Weather Bureau gave a strong warning on Tuesday that the El Nino pattern formed in the tropical Pacific could intensify in the second half of 2026, becoming one of the strongest in 7 decades. Forecasters expect the event to bring excessive rain to the Americas and hot, dry conditions across Asia, where crop planting is already being disrupted. Sea surface temperatures in the region have exceeded El Nino thresholds, and around half of the forecasting models indicate the event could peak among the highest levels observed since 1950. The pattern is particularly damaging to Australia, which is one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, sugar, and beef.
It's another hot summer day across Korea with both rain and passing showers in the forecast. About the rain first, the mountainous areas of Jeju could see 10 to 60 millimeters of showers, while Jeollado and Gyeongsang-Namdo province might get 5 to 20 millimeters. Meanwhile, the rest of the country could see passing rain with 5 to 60 millimeters in the forecast, along with thunderstorms. And this afternoon, most regions will see afternoon temperatures climb above 30 degrees Celsius. Seoul, Daegu both getting up to 31 degrees, Gyeongju at 30 degrees Celsius. But the conditions combination of heat and humidity will make it feel even warmer and more uncomfortable. Then we're looking at a chance of more sudden rain tomorrow. Then Jeju and the South Coast will see more rain this week as the monsoon season is right around the corner.
Now that's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.